So good afternoon again. I have to admit, when we were designing the conference, I was very afraid at the end of the second day, and we are going to talk about space policy, the room will be empty. But it's not like that. So everyone is still here, everyone is really interested in the topic, so thank you for all the participants. Now I would like to introduce the speakers, the stage. Sorry for my Estonian accent. So at first, Larry Martinez, from Professor Emeritus of Political Science from California State University. Please welcome. Then Clemence Poirier, she's a resident fellow seconded by SDSC to ESPI, European Space Policy Institute. And we have online with us Samuel Visner, Board of Directors, Space Information Sharing and Analysis Center. So thank you for joining us. When I got the opportunity to chair or lead the panel for cybersecurity policy in the space domain, then there are so many ideas, topics that we can actually cover here. And it was very difficult to choose maybe the direction. After some consultations with my panelists, it was clear that, and also listening to other previous panels, what we have had today and yesterday, then I think the mega constellation and satellite internet is definitely one of the lead topics that we will cover during this session here. And so definitely the question about the ownership of mega constellation and the footprint to our society. So what does it mean? How should we regulate it, or shouldn't we? We don't know yet. And also, if we are talking about space cybersecurity, I think 3 years ago, one expert in the field of satellite communication, he mentioned that, Paul, it doesn't make sense. Who should attack a satellite as a space segment? Because there's no value in it. So don't waste your time on this topic. This year we have seen that it's normal, and also it's normal that you are going to attack someone, and it's normality that also, let's say, constellations or satellite owners are being threatened to be hacked. So we can see that there is really a topic there, and we are having maybe two kinds of risks. One is, of course, coming from war, that one country is planning to attack the space segment, but of course we have the hackers and the unknown perspective, something we cannot predict, something we don't know. And if you read the Outer Space Treaty, the Outer Space Treaty is very clear. It describes a beautiful world. You know, everything is perfect, international cooperation, and we shouldn't be talking about war and defense in the space domain, but it's going to the wrong direction, unfortunately. But I think it's enough for my introduction right now. So it's always better to let the panelists speak. We will start here on my left-hand side with Larry. So please tell us about your thoughts about space cybersecurity policy and what have you been working on?
Yeah, thank you very much, Paul, and thank you also to all the organizers for this really excellent conference. And I really appreciate the name of the conference because it's brilliant, software-defined space, because it brings to mind cyberspace. And cyberspace is becoming the new battlefield of the 21st century. And here in Estonia, of course, this is the country that many people are looking to as having had one of the first experiences of a cyber conflict that transcended previous types of conflict. I'm a political scientist, so I'm not an engineer. I'm sort of dangerous because I'm retired. I'm living off of a California pension, and so I can pretty much say whatever I want, even more dangerous than a tenured professor.
But it's exactly what we need in such panels. Yeah.
Right. So the first thing as a good academic and talking to people at an academic conference is that we have to get into theory. So prepare yourselves. And so up to now, this conference has really been talking about access. Access to space, access to cyber, access to the technology, and then how do you regulate the technology in order to facilitate access. But why do you want access? What's the importance of access? And so political scientists, we look at this and we say, you want access because of content. It's the content of what the technology makes possible, the transmission of that content. And as a good political economist who has been teaching a course that I developed over 25 years ago called Cyberspace Citizenship, because in order to effectively govern cyberspace, you have to have the skills and the knowledge in order to participate fully in the governance of cyberspace. So we can ensure then that cyberspace is steered towards those types of societies and goals that we collectively want. So political scientists, we look at conflict, we look at how people, human beings, come together and make collaborative efforts, hopefully, to mitigate conflict and to arrive at a mutually, let's say, amenable outcome. All right, so a little bit of theory is that we also look for what is causing conflict. And what's causing conflict today is what a Nobel laureate in economics really very brilliantly outlined. And this is Oliver Williamson, who won the Nobel laureate in 2011 for his work in a theory called transaction cost economics. And you can look at examples throughout human history of where a technology has disrupted the order of things because what it did was to radically lower the transaction costs for accomplishing a particular function. And so one of the, if we go to information technologies, the leading example of this, and we're very aptly in Estonia, is in 1451, a goldsmith in Mainz, Germany, came up with an idea that you can create a cheaper way of producing information by movable type. And so Gutenberg developed movable type, which was later picked up by this unhappy monk in Wittenberg named Martin Luther. And Martin Luther, essentially disintermediated the monopoly on information that people were concerned about, which was the Catholic Church. So the Catholic Church had an information monopoly on God. It was carefully preserved through languages that no one could decipher, which was Latin. And because of the high cost of copying and transmitting information, the Catholic Church for centuries was able to monopolize political power and have people believing in what it was doing. And so then this monk disrupted the whole process and created the bloodiest war in European history, which was the 30 Years' War. So more people died in the 30 Years' War proportionate to the population than any other war. And what we're looking at today in a corollary is exactly the same kind of a disruptive event caused by a lowering of the transaction costs. And this thing that is doing it are the communication technologies, and most recently, the internet, and even more recently, it's social media. Social media is disrupting democratic governance in many countries of the world. Not only the United States with very well-known examples of the disruption to the political process, but in many other countries. And so this is having the effect of raising people's awareness of the role of social media and the way in which the social media make money. And so as a political economist, what you want to do is follow the money. The money will lead you then to better understanding the disintermediation that's taking place in democratic governance and in the international regime. And so what we're looking at here is how cyber is part of this politicization that's going on caused by the lowering of the information transaction costs, whereas the Ian Bremmer article in this very seminal edition of Foreign Affairs illustrates how this is disrupting the international order. And what we're looking at today is in outer space, and I want to thank Elon for helping my talk today. Thank you, Elon, is that he's buying Twitter. So we have what the Americans call soup to nuts, total vertical integration of a disintermediating technology. And so you have one person owning the launch vehicles, you have one person owning the Starlink large constellation satellites, and you have one person now owning the content on those satellites, which is Twitter. And there you go. And we now are looking at a completely disruptive situation, which is disintermediating governments, which is forcing, I was just at the Koplos meeting in Vienna this past June, where they're trying to come up with a way then of mitigating all these problems through collaborative action, but the United Nations is being disintermediated, nation states are being disintermediated, which means disintermediation means removal of the middleman. Removal of the middleman. Social media makes it possible for anyone to access millions of people. And you just look at how TikTok has destroyed 2/3 of the market valuation of Facebook, which used to be one of the largest corporations on earth.
Thank you, Larry, for the very interesting introduction and how everything is connected with each other. And it's a very good start here. And Clemence, I know you have written a very good report, so maybe you can say a few words about what you have done.
Thank you very much for having me. So I'm Clemence Poirier. I'm a resident fellow at the European Space Policy Institute in Vienna, Austria. I'm also seconded by CNES, the French space agency. So ESPI is the European think tank for space. So we conduct research on space policy and space law. And so as Larry said, we also conduct research on space commercialization and devolution of space commerce. And we also monitor this verticalization effect and the evolution of downstream applications and the, let's say, commoditization of space, in which like space systems become a bit means to an end. What matters now is the downstream application that you develop on top of the infrastructure that you built. So we provide decision makers with mid to long-term view on space policy issues, including space cybersecurity. And recently we released a report called The War in Ukraine from a Space Cybersecurity Perspective, which is a case study on the cyber attack that affected Viasat's KASAT satellite at the beginning of the war. And we believe that this cyber attack is a good representative case of the current state of cybersecurity in the commercial space sector. So, as you know, the KASAT case, in the KASAT case, Russia exploited vulnerabilities in the user segment, but also on the supply chain. And the vulnerabilities that were exploited are very representative of other cyber attacks in the space sector. So on the supply chain, the VPN network, VPN appliance was exploited, and a vulnerability on the VPN provider Fortinet. It had a vulnerability that was discovered. It was not a zero-day vulnerability. The company a few years ago provided a patch, and apparently it probably was not implemented by either Viasat or Skylogic, Eutelsat's subsidiary, who is operating the ground segment. So Russia likely exploited the trust relationship between the space company and the VPN provider. So this is one example, and in the space sector, a lot of cyber attacks happen in the supply chain. So, for instance, in 2019, Airbus suffered from a similar attack. So this time it was China who exploited vulnerability in the VPN network of Airbus subcontractors, and it enabled them to access data, including confidential data on military systems. So this the supply chain is a very weak link because today companies are more aware of cybersecurity, so they try to increasingly protect their own systems, and they often forget about the supply chain. And the globalization of the supply chain, the diversification of the supply chain makes it also difficult to secure all the subcontractors. So you can have supply chain attacks on the hardware supply chain, so integrating counterfeit components, integrating components that do not work, components with backdoors, etc. But also on the software layers, with software vulnerabilities, software that have functions that are not planned, backdoors, malware, etc. So this is something that is becoming increasingly common in the space sector. And the other segment in the CASAT case that was exploded was the user segment. So the user terminals, there was a denial of service attack on the CASAT network where malicious modems were pushing into the network, which prevented real internet users from remaining online. And what we saw notably from research from the company IO Active, many vulnerabilities are constantly discovered on satellite user terminals, and they're not patched. Companies are taking warnings or with a grain of salt. They remain a bit skeptical about when cybersecurity companies warn them about vulnerabilities. And what this company did, and I recommend you to check their reports, is that they contact companies, they provide them with the solution, they tell them that their systems have vulnerabilities, and they try to be in contact with them to improve the cybersecurity of those companies. And sometimes companies do not really want to implement patches or solutions. So it also shows that the user segment is very vulnerable. So we also see in our report that the CASAT case is a representative case of the evolution of the militarization and weaponization of outer space through cyber means. And in this report, but I think we'll can talk about it a bit after, we provide lessons to learn from this event for the cybersecurity of the European space infrastructure, as well as how this event and other cyber operations in Ukraine can make a case for Europe to have a sovereign constellation.
Yes, thank you for the introduction. And next one, we will go now to online. Samuel, please talk about the space. Isaac, so what are you doing? And I think you will get also 2 slides.
We can forego the use of the slides if you don't mind. Let's not use them. Is that all right?
For me, it's okay. So technicians, no slides necessary.
Right. Thank you. Great. Thank you. So thank you very much. My name is Sam Visner. I am the vice chair of the board of directors of the Space Information Sharing and Analysis Center here in the United States. I'm also a professor of cybersecurity policy operations and technology at Georgetown University, Go Hoyas, and a fellow at the MITRE Corporation, which manages some of my country's federally funded research and development centers. And I want to thank the conference for allowing me to speak with you today. And I apologize that I cannot be there in person. I had eye surgery last Friday, and I am prohibited from flying for about a month. So please forgive me for having to do this virtually. A couple of thoughts here. Our question really at the Space ISAC is, what is to be done? which I think is actually an old Marxist phrase. You may remember him as capitalist philosopher, Karl Marx, who used to ask, what done? Our answer to that question at the Space Information Sharing and Analysis Center is mostly operational. We're not a policy organization. Having said that, if one operates in an active operational domain, clearly there are going to be policy implications, and we will have some policy ideas. So first, the environment in which we're working is clearly this new hyperscaler environment. And I think Larry did an excellent job of characterizing it. Think of a world in which you have global cloud providers, billions of IoT devices, throwing off a lot of data, being consumed and analyzed by machine learning and artificial intelligence applications, being connected with a global 5G backplane in space, 12,000 satellites initially for SpaceX, up to 40,000, 7,700 at some point with Blue Origin, other mega constellations planned. So we're looking at a new kind of hyperscaler environment in which global networks and global smart infrastructures are going to need to be are going to be developed, and they're going to need to be secured. But that's only one part of the story. The other part of the story is everything else the space constellations do. For example, they provide position, navigation, and timing, and there are several constellations that are in orbit and continue to be modernized. Of course, there's the US GPS system and Galileo and Baidu and other systems that the Russians also have a global positioning system in orbit. So we count on these systems every day. And lastly, of course, we count on space for remote sensing. We use it for everything, to take a look at using optical sensing to see what's happening in the Ukraine, which I think has been of enormous value in the war that is taking place in the Ukraine, as well as remote sensing that helps farmers know where they should plant their crops. There is an estimate, I don't have empirical data to support it, that says in the United States we would lose, without our space systems, some 20% of our food supply. And think about how we communicate with IoT devices on farms that sense soil conditions, PNT devices that help us move trucks from the farm to our local grocery store, as well as move large combines across the farm to navigate in precisely the spot where we need to, and the communications needed to communicate with all of the devices on the farm, as well as the communications needed for transportation. We're looking at new missions. We're looking at space transportation. We're looking at space manufacturing, space colonization, and space mining. All of these things, which were in the realm of science fiction when I was growing up and read this stuff far too avidly, are now becoming a reality. What is the Space ISAC doing about this? Actually, as much as we can. We have close to 60 members now. Many of the leading companies in the private sector in commercial space are members of the ISAC. I'm not going to show the slide because I think I don't want to use up that much time trying to use PowerPoint. But we have companies ranging from Maxar to Raytheon. We characterize the market in terms of launch, on-orbit operations, ground services, ground station as a service, manufacturing. And where we're working, our membership also includes the partnerships we're building with other organizations like JAXA and ESA, with NASA, with Space Command, with the Department of Homeland Security in the United States, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. So our principal job is information sharing. What is vulnerable? What are the threats? What can be done? We'll be opening our cyber vulnerability lab and our 24/7 watch center, which will correlate all sorts of threat and vulnerability data in real time and use that to help our members improve the security of their Constellations. Speaking of policy, and I sort of hinted that I would do that, There is, as I'm sure you can imagine, a very active discussion in the United States as to whether space systems should be considered a sector of critical infrastructure. Under Presidential Policy Directive 21, there are 16 sectors. Space is not one of them. A very active conversation is underway in Washington. These conversations get a lot of energy, but they take a lot of time. And it's necessary to be really quite patient about this. The consensus is emerging that whether we make the designation, space systems will be treated as critical. All of our national critical functions depend on space. All of the other 16 critical infrastructure sectors depend on space. And there is a concern that other countries see space as critical to the United States, to our national and economic security, and therefore are intending to exploit whatever vulnerabilities they can find. I would say the United States is actually a little behind Europe, which is regarding space as critical infrastructure in a more formal sense. In any case, I do believe that we will eventually make this declaration, and whether we make it or not, policy is beginning to emerge around how do we set standards? What should we do in terms of unifying sector risk management for space? How should information be shared more efficiently and be done in a more centralized and consolidated manner? The Space ISAC is working on all of those issues alongside its increasingly operational role. And for those who are inclined to visit beautiful Colorado Springs, we are expecting in the last quarter of this year or the first quarter of next year to actually cut the ribbon on our operations center. So with that, I will turn this over to our moderator, and thank you very much for allowing me to participate today and your patience in allowing me to participate virtually. Thank you.
Thank you for all the thoughts. It was very, very interesting. And when we're talking about constellations, then as already Samuel mentioned, then satellite navigation is also one of the constellations. And I think it's the best example of a redundant system. So if you lose one of the constellations, nothing will happen. Our life will continue because we have it by different countries, owned by different countries, by military, by civil, and I think the number of satellites in orbit is enough. The only disadvantage of it is it's everything 100% taxpayers' money, and all of the projects have been very expensive. The only reason why we have SpaceX or then the Starlink constellation today is that it was not designed by government. It was a private-public partnership. And it's so-called the new space that the government is more or less procuring the service, but not owning the infrastructure, right? And now Correct. We have the situation where there's one company who is really owning the monopoly of one specific service. And as everyone knows, then internet is, let's say, the basis of our, what we need to live, to also defend ourselves, and also maybe for services that we actually do not really need. Larry was talking about them. And then, and now I have heard also thoughts from different colleagues that there are political discussions that such a constellation should not be owned by one private company, that this kind of, it is a critical infrastructure, right? That it should be government-owned, but it goes again against the new space philosophy, right? Because we have it only because we were doing it the other way around, private-public partnership, but now the government wants to basically take it over. And the second question maybe is that how many redundant constellation should we have? So
let me respond to that question if I could. The first thing I would say is that I don't know that I would regard a company as holding a monopoly at this point. SpaceX has plenty of competition, and there is a lot of competition for LEOsat and MEOsat and even some GEOsat based communications. And one doesn't have to use any of these systems. There is plenty of terrestrial connectivity in the world. And a lot of the use of these systems are going to be in areas where density is low and it's difficult to establish terrestrial communication. So I'm not entirely sure I would say that A, these companies monopolize communications, and B, that any one of these companies is necessarily a monopoly. And it's also not clear to me that government would have made the investment to build these systems, or that the investment would continue if the companies that made the investment found that essentially they were nationalized after the investment had been made. So I think that's a very delicate conversation. But I would say that they enhance security in the way that you described, which is to provide an awful lot of redundancy. Once there are some 12,000 and eventually 40,000 satellites in orbit, that provides an awful lot of redundancy. And if some of those satellites fail and don't work, and sometimes that happens, there is enough additional capacity to provide the service that customers require. But I would take a look, Larry and friends, at what's happening in remote sensing with companies like Maxar and Planet Labs. The latter, I think, has over 200 satellites in orbit in 3 different orbital domains. And they're able to provide remote sensing capabilities that are useful both economically and for national security perspectives, as we're seeing in the Ukraine. And there are so many of those satellites on orbit that, again, they give us a certain amount of redundancy, both within those constellations, as well as complementing the capability that we have through government-owned remote sensing satellites. So I'm not as concerned about the market perspective, perhaps, as one might be. From my perspective, these systems are providing a lot of valuable services to people who might not have had access to space-based capabilities. And at the same time, they're also providing redundancy and additional capabilities to the public sector. Thank you.
Thank you.
If I could just interject here, I completely agree with many of those technologies, remote sensing, navigation, and so forth. But if you look at, for instance, Apple just announced a new iPhone. This new iPhone will allow direct text messaging through the Global Star, a large constellation system, or somewhat large, not anymore, actually. But they're disintermediating, that is to say, once again, they're bypassing the terrestrial network, going directly up to the big constellation for texting. That's just the beginning, folks. They want to put everything up there on the big constellations. And here's the key, is that the big constellations are dependent on a business model. Follow the money. And the money leads directly to a cybersecurity problem because it's based on a business model that's characterized as surveillance capitalism. Read the book by Professor Zuboff of Harvard University and how you have to have a porous interface between the user and the network in order to be able to track users' behaviors on large social media platforms in order to sell that user information to advertisers. That directly contributes to a cybersecurity problem because the whole business model militates against a cyber-secure system because it has to be porous in order to be able to track users' behaviors in all platforms across all media. And this is now the problem with Amazon now announcing that it wants to put up the Kuiper constellation system. So it's not, we're exactly correct. SpaceX is facing competition from another big technology company called Amazon that wants to put up its large and guess what they're going to do? The same business model. The business model is based on a porous interface between the user and the network, bypassing, because they can land all over the globe, and bypassing many traditional means of national regulation and control over these systems. Rwanda has announced in the ITU, of course, 300,000 satellites that they're potentially going to register. So we're talking about a huge explosion of what social media platforms are aiming to connect amongst billions of users with a business model that directly contributes to cyber insecurity.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I agree with those issues who are global issues that affect all users and the space community at large. So now if we really look at Europe and what are the issues of Europe, so regarding your questions on Starlink in itself is not necessarily the issue. The issue is that whether you are gonna, as satellites are becoming entirely part of the digital infrastructure, are you gonna put your government communication, your access to social media and connectivity, your support to your military operations in the end of a few private actors. So right now, the few constellations that may operate in Europe are Starlink, Kuiper, and OneWeb. So what we can both learn from events in the war in Ukraine, but also from the need for secure communications, is that if you put your connectivity in the hands of a few private actors, that means you put your connectivity in as a basis that is based on the quality of your relationships with your allies and with a few individuals. So if they change their mind, then you lose all the connectivity. So the issue is more for Europe, what is the price of digital sovereignty? What is the price of strategic autonomy? And those issues are very important in many aspects at the heart of the EU policies and of many member states' policies. So I think it's important to consider it. And when it comes to your second questions regarding how many redundant constellations do we need? I think redundancy is fundamental for a good space cybersecurity policy, but it's not enough. And if you want to have a good space cybersecurity policy, you need to have a holistic view at cybersecurity. So you need redundancy in case you have a failure or an attack on one systems, but you also need encryption. So either end-to-end encryption or quantum key distributions, but you also need hardening. So that means you're gonna wrap your electric components on your satellites with isolating materials so that you can withstand electronic attacks, laser interference, space weather events, etc. But you also need substitutions, so replacing a system by a system of another nature, so not redundancy with similar GNSS systems, but with substitutions, you can replace, for instance, a Earth observation satellite by a HAPS or a drone. So systems that are providing similar services that you have to include in your capabilities so that you remain active and you never lose the connectivity or the access to space services. So those are aspects that are important. And for military actors, what is also important is to be able to operate in degraded environment. So if you're now we see, especially with the war in Ukraine, that commercial space satellites are increasingly used in support of military operations, but they are also prime targets to cyber attack. So the cyber attack is going to come whether you like it or not. So you need to have your soldiers to be able to operate with technologies and tools from the pre-electronic era. So what we said yesterday, you need to know how to read a map, and you need to have systems that are not necessarily reliant on space systems. And that also includes, for instance, for nuclear deterrence, if you are a country with nuclear weapons, to have the possibility to use that solution without depending on cyberspace or space. So
what you're saying, secure connectivity initiative is the right thing for Europe, and we should have redundant constellations in the end. So different options, not only relying on one technology provider.
Yes, exactly. Having a diversified selection of space systems that provide solutions in Europe, but when it comes to government communications, critical infrastructure, or systems, SATCOMs that will be used to support military operations. I think the recent events make a clear case for a European sovereign constellation. and that Europe should keep going with the EU Secure Connectivity Initiative.
Good. We have only a few seconds left, so maybe a final question where you can give only 3 sentences is that what are the next things where policymakers should focus on to make the space sector more safe and secure against potential hacks? So what should I do? Let's start with Larry. 3 sentences.
3 sentences? I think that they need to critically look at the long-term sustainability guidelines that establish the best practices that was recently approved by UN COPLOS. I think it provides a distinct path forward that many countries should look to, and I think that that's a good place to start.
Clemence.
So I would say first for Europe to adopt the EU NIS2 directive, which will officially recognize space as a critical infrastructure. So I think this is essential. The second thing is awareness raising. So if you have the right tools, the right laws, and the right policies, but the space operators are not aware of it and are not aware of how to comply, then it's useless. So raising awareness in the space community and in the cyber community so that there is true cooperation is also really important. And the third thing, which we mentioned several times and that Annette mentions, is skills. So develop the right skills, have the right master's degree, the right higher education program to ensure that students, whether in engineering, political science, or other fields, are trained on the issue of space cybersecurity.
Thank you. And Samuel.
Thank you. 3 things. First, I think make that declaration in Europe, in the United States, in essentially all the liberal democracies and among our partners, that space systems are critical infrastructure. 2, strengthen international cooperation for the security and resilience of space systems, something where the Space ISAC has been trying to play a role. We've just signed our agreement with JAXA, and we're hoping to sign agreements with other international partners. And 3, continue to support the work that we are doing in the security and resilience of space. We're working on blockchain technology. We're looking at the use of zero trust architectures. We have a working group to secure the supply chain. We have an information sharing working group. And all of these are designed to improve the intrinsic security of all aspects of the space system architectures on which we depend. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for all the panelists. I think it was very interesting. Unfortunately, it was a very short discussion, so I would really like to continue covering also many other topics, and also many thanks for the audience. So, yeah, thank you for coming, and see you also next time here in Tallinn.
Thank you.
Thank you.